The Federal Reserve has been around for about 100 years, but the British ruling class have been pushing to have a central bank in the United States ever since we declared independence. Weird. There were actually two central banks in the country before the Fed, and both of them only lasted for 20 years. Today, we're gonna tell you what happened after that. Let's get it.
I'm not a financial advisor.
But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, The Bid Boy. And today we're getting deep. If you want your political, financial, and historical IQs to increase, make sure to watch this entire video. In this series, we're taking a look at the creature from Jekyll Island from G. Edward Griffin. And we're going through the big lessons from each chapter or series of chapters. In this video, we're gonna take a look at chapter 5, which talks about how there was a battle to create a central bank in the United States way before the Federal Reserve was established in 1913. As the country was being formed just after the Revolutionary War, there was a massive push to get a central bank installed in the US. This would be a central bank that ran on a similar system as England, who we just won our independence from. And in many ways, it would allow England to control us through our economy, even if we became politically independent. The first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791 under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, who was a big shill for the central bankers and later a real big ham on the stage. Hamilton was closely connected to the Both Children family and other important banking dynasties from England, as they were pushing for their interests here in the US. His ideas were not popular among many of the founding fathers though, especially Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the Anti-Federalists, the best ones. Jefferson and his allies believed that the Constitution, which was just drafted a few years before, did not give the government the authority to create a central bank. They worried that it could allow bankers to take over the country. And they were right. They couldn't prevent the bank from being established, but they were able to force a compromise. The first Bank of the United States was given a 20-year charter and operated as both a private corporation and a government entity. This meant that the government would have to review the status of the bank in 20 years and decide if they wanted to continue with the same policies or get rid of the bank. 20 years after the Federal Reserve with the Great Depression. Anyways, while it was active, the bank had the exclusive right to issue national currency and was responsible for managing the government's finances, giving them massive power over the economy in the entire country. In 1811, the 20-year charter for the first Bank of the US was up for renewal, but it had become even more unpopular than it was when it was established. The public had 2 decades to see that the Anti-Federalists, well, they were right. Central banks did create problems with power centralization. The government was forced to allow the charter to expire without renewing it because there was such a backlash against the idea of a central bank. The first Bank of the United States may have failed, but it changed the history of the country forever by setting the precedent that a central bank could happen here. And it showed how much power a central bank it would have over the country. The victory was also short-lived though, because just 5 years later, the bankers were back and ready to set up another central bank. And they came up with the least creative name you can possibly think of. The Second Bank of the United States. It was chartered in 1816 and was a direct consequence of economic problems that the country was facing after the War of 1812, which cost the country a ton of money and the White House. Yeah, that's right. A lot of people didn't realize this, but British troops actually burned down the White House and many other government buildings in DC in 1814. Those troops were led by a guy named Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn. I'm not making any of that up. Every part of that is actually his name. That's not the only thing weird either. I also find it a bit strange that the second central bank of the US, which directly benefits British bankers, is getting established 2 years after British troops conquered DC. Technically, the War of 1812 ended in a stalemate, but we're still here and they're still there. I guess the question is, did it really end in a stalemate if we ended up getting a British central bank a few years later?
It's now been 200 years since the British came here to the White House under somewhat different circumstances. They made quite an impression. They really lit up the place.
I am a little embarrassed as I stand here to think that 200 years ago, my ancestors tried to burn this place down. Now, looking around me, I can see you've got the place a little better defended today. You're clearly not taking any risks with the Brits this time.
These international bankers saw the second bank as a way to regain control over the US monetary system after the dissolution of the first bank. They wanted to integrate the US economy into the global financial system by establishing a central bank that could influence monetary policy and manage government debt. The second bank operated very similar to the first bank that came before it. It was a private corporation, but the US government held a large chunk of its stock and appointed some of its directors. Sounds familiar? This was a sweet deal for the bank because they could issue currency and manage government funds while operating still for profit. The whole point of the central bank was to stabilize the economy, or at least that's what the public was told, but it ended up doing the exact opposite. The bank set the ground for bubbles in different sectors and concentrated most of the country's wealth in the hands of only a few powerful bankers. By controlling the money supply and manipulating credit, the bank was able to direct economic activity in ways that benefited its shareholders and aligned with the interests of European banking families. The bank once again became extremely unpopular, and another political movement rose up in opposition to it. The movement against the central bank was led by President Andrew Jackson, who became one of the loudest voices opposing the bankers. In 1832, the second bank's charter was up for renewal, and Jackson vetoed a bill to renew it. After the veto, Jackson continued his campaign to dismantle the bank. He ordered the withdrawal of federal funds from the second bank so they could be redistributed to state banks. This weakened the bank to the point that it was unable to continue after the charter expired in 1836. The bankers don't give up though. They would go back to the drawing board and use everything they learned from their failures to create an unstoppable central bank. Some of their main lessons were that the banks went too far too fast, and they also allowed the politicians to have too much control. In the future, they would push for central banks that did not need to be renewed and that could not be stopped by any president or act of Congress. It would take 60 years before they would be able to establish another central bank, but as you can see, it's lasted over 100 years instead of the 20-year records held by the first two central banks. There is no doubt that there was a lot of discussion about those first two central banks and where they went wrong at that meeting on Jekyll Island in 1913. And that no doubt played a factor into the Federal Reserve that we have today. That's all I got. Be blessed. Good boy out.